my, it's Navy Day. Part 2 of the Gloucester 400 War of 1898 series, which is just part 1 and part 2, and this is it. But reminding me, with me, Laura Ventimiglia, who has kindly offered to be the interviewer or co-conversant with me. So I thank you for that, Laura.
Thank you.
And she's gotten up to date on the War of 1898 through part 1. And remind people in the audience, the War of 1898 had a cause that we talked about, and Gloucester men joined up. Because those days it was all men.
Yeah.
Gloucester men joined up with the being soldiers and being sailors, but this is the sailor part. But remind us what happened last time.
So the last time we talked about the land part, the army.
Yes.
Men who served in, as it turns out, Company G.
Company G.
I'm presuming the G was for Gloucester.
Well,
Let's just say it was.
It was perfect. It coincidentally worked out well. But it was, I think, A, B, C, D, and so forth to K. But G was the Gloucester one.
Was the Gloucester. Yeah. So as Wayne mentioned, it was a war built around humanitarian efforts.
Yes.
So I keep looking at Wayne because you're going to check me in case I get something wrong. So it was a war built around humanitarian efforts, not an effort to take over territory, which I found really, really interesting.
Right.
And so the situation in Cuba, which was unhumanitarian, attracted a lot of attention. Clara Barton was down there.
The Red Cross.
The Red Cross. And she actually invited this senator from Vermont,
Redfield Proctor.
And he was so taken aback and so overcome by the poor conditions that he actually, when he returned to the United States, gave a speech.
Right.
Or he wouldn't call it a speech. He just thought he was just giving a report on the conditions he found in Cuba.
Factual report. Of course, there's newspaper reporters up in the gallery, and they're taking down every word and became headlines the next day. Okay. But he was giving a factual report to his fellow senators.
And that seemed to, the coverage in the newspapers seemed to mobilize the country.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, there was a call for volunteers.
Right.
There were 125,000 volunteers nationwide, and 100 of those were from Gloucester.
Even though we'd only expect for our population about 25.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
4 times in terms of land forces.
Yeah.
Then on top of that, there was 300. We're going to talk about Navy.
Right.
Almost 300 joined the Navy.
And so there was also a person from Gloucester, born, bred, died in Gloucester, Lieutenant James
Centennial
Nutt. Now you have to tell
whom I met.
I know. So
yes.
Wayne met him. So he's actually buried in Beechbrook Cemetery.
Yes, he is.
And over in Essex Ave, where the veterans
exactly.
are.
There's a whole veterans little region up there.
That's over there. Now Wayne actually met him, so I know it's cutting into the Navy time, but this is such an interesting story. I think it's worth repeating.
No, it isn't.
Okay.
You got to get to part 1, and you'll hear about my adventure.
Okay, so Wayne's going to tell us to go back to part 1 so you can hear that. One of the, I do have a question for you.
Sure.
So it's the War of 1898.
Yes.
But it was also called the Spanish-American War.
Yes.
So I'm curious as to why the reference is typically, when I talk with you or when you talk about it, War of 1898.
Well, I use War of 1898 because the monument down the end of the street,
okay,
Pleasant and Prospect Street, uses that, the War of 1898.
Oh, okay.
Curiously enough, the veterans, including James Centennial Nutt, whom I met, on his little button, had the USW, United Spanish War Veterans, USWV button. So they used the Spanish War.
Okay.
And it's interchangeable. But my belief is that the reason it became War of 1898 is because, unlike the Civil War, unlike the Revolution, actually unlike World War I and others, it was just 1 year.
1 year.
In fact, less than 1 year. It was 4 months. The United States won the war, hands down, within 4 months. And Then it became the War of 1898. It happened in between April and basically the fighting was over in August. What can I say? That's kind of the answer to your question.
Yeah. So before you jump into the Navy, and we just want to go back to
Senator Proctor.
Proctor again, because Wayne, and I mentioned this in the series 1, session 1, Wayne actually wrote this book, The Cuban Speech. The United States goes to war with Spain, 1898. It's available at the bookstore on Main Street by special order. They're very happy to get it for you. And this woke me up to what the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, was all about. I had a little bit of an interest in it because I had a great uncle who fought in it.
No kidding.
Not from Gloucester.
Yeah.
So it was always rolling around in the back of my head. I learned a tremendous amount about the war here, but what I came to appreciate the most was the role of Senator Proctor and how he energized people with the conditions down in Cuba. So you mentioned the monument. Before you jump into the Navy, could I just ask one more question about
Please
the
do.
monument?
Yeah.
You also said, and which is unusual as well, that the veterans from that war were part of the committee who actually designed and made decisions about the monument.
Yes.
But who led the committee?
Very good question. Both it tells you something to know that this charge for a monument was led by a woman whose name is Martha Brooks. Martha Brooks was born to wealth, and before 1920, women didn't have the right to vote or hold public office and so forth. After 1920, beginning 1922, Martha Brooks put her name on the ballot to become part of the city council in Gloucester, which was in those days called the alderman. Martha Brooks got all of the women's vote and some of the men's. She did tremendously well in the election. She was elected as an alderman, and they called it alderman, not alderwoman. So.
Yeah.
But she's an alderman, and she's got the Veterans Affairs Committee. She's running the Veterans Affairs.
Oh.
They didn't have an agent or veterans agent or such. She was the Veterans Affairs person that you went to for Veterans Affairs in the city of Gloucester. Well, people came up and said, there's this committee of United Spanish War veterans, and they haven't been able to do anything. They're interested in making a monument. It's been 25 years since the war. Down the street, there's Joan of Arc. World War I's taken care of. There's a monument there in the Civil War, but there's no monument for them. Yeah. Can you help them out? Normally, she could have sent a letter. I'm sorry, I'm busy, I've got other things. She didn't do that. She took it on with both hands as a project she was going to see through. She was elected in 1922. That monument, that granite block down there, was in place in 1923.
Wow.
On Veterans Day. So she had a deadline. She was going to make it happen. Whether she was elected, re-elected,
she didn't. She
was going to make that happen.
Well, it's interesting.
And you mentioned the committee.
Yeah.
You mentioned the committee.
Yep.
Remember, the committee still existed.
Yeah.
How did she deal with it diplomatically? And I'm going to say, you women are
diplomatic,
beautiful at diplomacy, relationships, having people not be offended or walk out in disgust and resign. And so she was all set to do it alone. But she sent word to the committee, invited them, this 10-member Veterans Committee, 5 Company G land soldiers, 5 Navy sailors.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the way.
Oh, I didn't realize the Navy sailors
were on it. The 10 came, she invited them to meet in City Hall. So she's supposedly, essentially, I guess you might use the word hostess. She's the hostess of the committee meeting in the auspices of the City Hall, officially and nicely, which at that time, if you were in City Hall in 1923, you could have seen over on the wall a portrait of a gentleman whose picture is here on the screen.
Oh.
Who by then was an admiral. He'd been promoted, but in the War of 1898 was a lieutenant who was a junior lieutenant.
Okay.
The same as John Kennedy during World War II.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And Lieutenant Richard Wainwright.
Ah.
This man's picture,
yeah.
the Navy
yeah.
picture, was on the wall in City Hall chambers. Next to his picture was a painting of the USS Gloucester, which he commanded during the war in great battles. And also, there was a flag in a display case that I'll talk about later.
Okay.
All Navy. They were meeting in the council chambers, 5 Company G, 5 Navy, in essentially a church with a shrine to the Navy. But when they arrived, the chairman, she became the chairman. She was accepted to be the leader now. When she issued the invitation, she was the Veterans Affairs woman, and she had more on the ball than they did. She was happy, and they were happy to let her run the show.
Yeah.
The 10 veterans, they offered ideas, they talked about the war, the design, but she was running the show. Also equally passive, ex officio being present, was Mayor McGinnis at that time. But the only really dynamic, active, lively person was the one you asked, Martha Brooks.
Sure.
All right. That's how the monument came to be.
And what caught my ear, too, is that you said the monument was unveiled in 1923.
The monument was dedicated.
Dedicated in 1923.
And there's a story behind that. It was dedicated November 11th because that was the deadline that Martha Brooks made for herself, that it was going to be in place. The stone was in place, but wasn't ready. The tablets, the bronze tablets, there was a delay. So she made it happen. People were already, the congressman, the mayor, everybody, they were going to have their speeches. There were people, the admiral that we're talking about was sick. He was old. I think he had a stroke. He was in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
He was not in any condition to travel or come up to Gloucester. Loved the city, wrote letters to the committee, offered his suggestions on the monument, but he was not able to come. Therefore, Martha Brooks had issued invitations for his granddaughter to attend on November 11th, and his brother, who was a retired Navy man in Boston, to attend as honored guests on November 11th. Now, these people were going to converge and come in, school children ready to sing America and things like that. And the mayor was ready to speak, the congressman was coming in. There was also a head of the United Spanish War Veterans. She was not going to change November 11th and say, we don't have the tablets. She's going to have something. So the answer to your question, it was dedicated on November 11th by her fiat. It was going to happen. But it was unveiled technically with the tablet. The next occasion was Memorial Day in May of 1924. So on those plaques that we see, the bronze tablets that are in the lettering, that was done in time for Memorial Day 1924.
Wow. So the date that caught my attention, that caught my ear, was 1923.
Because?
Because this year, 2023, we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of Gloucester. Even though we collectively, the city, recognize that it's really more than 400 years. That's why you see the reference to 400 plus. But the years, so 1898 was 125 years ago. So the war was 125 years ago. That's this anniversary for the war itself. The dedication to the monument was 1923. 100 years ago.
Yes.
And now here we are again in 2023 paying homage to those men and women.
Right.
The men may have gone to war, but the woman behind ran the committees, helped out with the Red Cross, did offered all kinds of support to families in the community.
Speaking of support to the family, realizing now, if a man dies, either his mother, his sisters, if he's married, his wife, the children, somebody's left behind grieving and at a loss. And the community of women here that still were behind were important to that. there was a whole thing called the Louisa Parsons Auxiliary. In other words, there was the United Spanish War veterans, all men, and then there was the Louisa Parsons Auxiliary of the women or sisters or mothers associated with the veterans of the war.
Wow.
So, and they all met on different occasions in headquarters down on Duncan Street. At that time, Duncan Street was not only where the police station was, but there were 3 floors. And the 3rd floor was a meeting room, which was for veterans. And largely the United Spanish War veterans met there, including this committee, until Martha Brooks reached out to bring them into City Hall and brought them in. I don't doubt that Martha Brooks was intending that she would knit together conflicting ideas about the monument.
And she did. All right, so I'll let you move on, because this is also very interesting. I do want to thank you, though, because in this year of celebrating our 400th anniversary, it's wonderful that you're bringing all of this to the attention of people in Gloucester, to us, beyond the community of Gloucester. It's just nice to have that attention and that honor. So thank you.
It's a great pleasure. I know the veterans, when they put this in Martha Brooks, when she put together this monument, intended that it would be a reminder, a highly visible, prominent, and hopefully daily looked at and, stimulating monument that would say, this is as good as we got. Maybe you can do better, or at least as good as we did. Because they intervened. Figure what they did. And looking back, this is the Navy and the Army both. Looking back, Cuba, an undeveloped, backward country, because it was a colony, and Spain did nothing but exploit the colony. Nobody was educated. Nobody was brought up to be important in themselves, self-esteem. They were put to work, almost enslaved, in the sugar plantations and so forth. Where we have brought ourselves, and the Red Cross helped, and Senator Proctor's address brought it to mind, and the churches gave sermons. People were ready to march on Cuba, so-called our neighbor, it was so near, to liberate those people from the Spanish regime, which had been so harsh, and included, we last time mentioned this, included concentration camps.
I was just going to say that. And didn't you say the last time that this was the first time in history that concentration camps exist?
Yes.
1898.
1898, well, actually for 3 years before 1898,
sure.
The men were in the hills fighting like guerrilla warfare against the Spanish, and the Spanish decided, serves you right, we're going to bring your wives and families and old folk, and very vulnerable people, and put them behind the stockade and a wooden fence with guards, a killing fence if you tried to escape.
Right.
And they were in there without access to their crops and their usual little family farms. They were in there at the mercy of the Spanish supplies. The Spanish didn't feed them properly, didn't bring medication. There was no doc. They were open to the elements. They could die of exposure. The clothes on their back in the tropics, melted away. They were not well provided for. The death rate in a place called Matanzas was on the seacoast, just about the size of Gloucester, and a seaport with usually about 20,000 people, just like Gloucester at the time. The concentration camp was seeing a death rate of hundreds each month. Company G that we're talking about, the Gloucester boys, went to Matanzas and saw what had been there, and they helped develop the place, put roads in, of course, close the concentration camp, feed the people, serve them vaccinations and so forth, so their health would improve. The death rate went down to 50 a month, or a normal death rate. And I want to go to the Navy.
Yes,
right?
I know. I was going to say the monument, because on one side there's the land forces on the monument, on the other side there's the Navy represented. So go ahead.
Now there is.
Yes.
But it was a controversy because you can imagine, we have a local sculptor everybody's familiar with, Walker Hancock.
Mm-hmm.
When Walker Hancock was asked to design, create a monument to the people who had died from the Pennsylvania Railroad, which exists the monument exists in Philadelphia, the main train station. Anybody can look it up if you search on the computer, Walker Hancock or Pennsylvania, Philadelphia Monument, something. You will see what that is.
Yeah.
And it's a famous one. It was his favorite of all of his, everything he designed. It's his favorite. And that design was the Archangel Michael taking up a dead soldier, a dead soldier of the war. So there's a single soldier, a solitary individual, representative of over 1,000 who died in that Pennsylvania Railroad group. Well, if you were Mrs. Brooks, Martha Brooks has to deal with a conflict because the Navy, use for the moment numbers, the Navy, Gloucester people, almost 300 were in the Navy.
What, 300 Gloucester people?
Right.
So we had 100 land forces and we had 300 Navy.
Right.
Wow.
And that meant that if you had 100 people, random people in the Navy, 100 people in the randomly at the Navy, 100 people, raise your hand who's from Gloucester. One hand would go up.
Wow.
1% of the Navy was from Gloucester.
Wow.
At the time. The Navy recognized that. That's why there was a ship called the USS Gloucester, because they were going to name the ship after the place that was giving all the Navy men recruiting. If you were Martha Brooks and you had to design a monument, the first thing might be, I know what I'm going to deal with. I'm going to deal with 5 Navy people, representative of 300 others, who are going to say, we're entitled to the monument, just like is on the wall over there in City Hall, and the Admiral and the USS Gloucester, and, and the Walker Hancock idea, which would be one person, maybe it would be the Navy and the Army, the inter-service rivalry. Right. And unfortunately, for the Army, although Army people died in the war, of course, the Navy won the war.
Tell us about
sea
that.
battles. Sea battles won the war.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's take, oddly enough, a contradiction to what I said a seeming contradiction to what I said the first. You remember in part 1, I said to you, the war wasn't about the Maine, wasn't about the battleship Maine.
Yes.
Well, for one person in that war, it was about the Maine, because eventually he was Admiral Wainwright, whose portrait was on the wall in City Hall, had been second in command of the Maine battleship.
Oh, that's right. I remember you mentioning that.
When it sunk, he was the one that said, lower the lifeboat on that night when it blew up. He was also given the dismal task, the very sad task, of salvaging the body from that wreck. There were over 200 down there. Right. And he worked night and day on a tender, the small vessel for the Navy, that moved from shore to the wreck and back to the shore to the wreck every day and night, whatever the weather was, with him in charge. And he never left the boat, never went ashore for 7 weeks.
Wow.
After that event, well, let's go to a screen that would show the Maine wreck. You'll see that the wreck was not entirely sunk. It was the waters of the harbor were somewhat shallow, and the top part of the ship, the rigging, was still in view of the battleship Maine. And the flag still flew from the battleship, as you see in the picture.
Yeah.
After 7 weeks, when the 200 bodies had been brought up and properly buried in Havana. The Spanish people, the Spanish officer, told Admiral Wainwright, at that time Lieutenant Wainwright, that he would take down the flag off the vessel. And this is what Lieutenant Wainwright told him. Tell the officer in charge of the guard that if any Spaniard touches the flag that flies from that wreck, there will be another wreck in Havana Harbor. Tell him that I will sink his barge myself. That flag, that American flag, was finally lowered by Lieutenant Wainwright himself, and brought respectfully back to Washington. Now, what were you going to do with Lieutenant Wainwright once his battleship was sunk under him? He was given command of the next ship ready, which was the USS Gloucester.
Wow.
That's how he became the commander. So placed in charge of the USS Gloucester is a man who had experienced firsthand the sinking of the Maine and who was ready to seek his revenge against the Spaniards. One thing I should say, it's deviating from, shifting gears from this topic, is that Senator Proctor's speech was March 17th, 1898.
Right.
The country knew from that speech on, from that date on, that it was just a matter of time, days or weeks, before we would be at war with Spain to end that inhumane treatment. When did the Navy recruiting office open up in Gloucester?
Oh, good question. Am I supposed to know that?
No.
Oh, good.
The Gloucester archives, they were so proud of their achievement of how many men and who. They published as part of the city directory a roll of honor of those who joined the Navy. And it shows the date from the first date that the Navy recruiting office was open. March 17th was the speech.
Yep.
What do you read as the first date on that list?
Right here?
Yes.
March 22nd.
Yes.
Wow.
Days after Proctor's speech.
And I think that goes to the point that Proctor's speech was so instrumental in mobilizing the country.
There was a line.
Not the sinking of the USS Maine that has received
that happened
attention.
in February.
Right.
Right.
So that was February 1898, and it wasn't until, as I understand it, years and years and years, I don't want to guess at how many years, but much later, the history book reflected back and wrote the USS Maine as the cause. But it really wasn't. The USS Maine had already been sunk.
Right.
And it wasn't until Proctor talked about the inhumanitarianism.
Right.
Right. I know. I just want to make that point because it's
perfect point. It's a perfect point.
And now to only have, I'm sorry again, 5 days later, 5 days after Proctor's address, 5 days later, the recruiting center in Gloucester opens up.
Right.
And people are in line to volunteer.
Right. I'm going to single out an individual for a reason who figures into the unveiling of the monument on Memorial Day in 1924.
Yeah.
His name, he's a Navy veteran known as Gilbert Venno.
Oh.
Venno has been spelled differently, even by Mr. Venno. I believe his frequent spelling in the Navy was Veneau. He's French Canadian. But in later life, for one reason or another, he chose to be known as Gilbert Venno, Veno. Now, Gilbert Venno, guess what's his birthday?
Oh, I don't, is this a trick question? I'm going to say March 17th.
Correct.
Oh, are you kidding?
This was unrehearsed and spontaneous. Unrehearsed and spontaneous.
Totally unrehearsed.
In fact, it was his 21st birthday.
Was it really?
The 21st birthday, reaching manhood, March 17th, 1898. Same day that Proctor gave his speech. All right. And when did he join the Navy?
Oh, my goodness.
What day did he show up at City, at the recruiter?
March 31st.
Within a few days of being 21.
Right, exactly.
Right. Now, you tell me, typically, right, what appeal would joining the armed services have to a man with a life otherwise, and he was living with his family and so forth, who would say, I think I'll leave the comforts of everything and go join the Navy at age 21.
Right.
Unless there was a strong impulse in driving him to help the people of Cuba.
Okay.
This is from, as you see stamped here, the Gloucester Archives, which is just across the street in the basement of City Hall. And if you go over and ask the archives, can I see the War of 1898 file or folder? There's a folder.
Yeah.
And besides this document, and it's lots of others, there's a typed memoir of a couple pages. And those 2 pages are by a woman, a school teacher in Gloucester, named Annabelle Stevenson. And you remember we were saying back then, before the history books went into gear, why did they go to war? The first 4 words are of her essay. The school teacher in Gloucester who was there, who lived through it, the start of the war and saw the men off to war, said, in our neighbor Cuba.
Wow.
And then she goes on, and the first 4 words, and then she talks about conditions in Cuba. She doesn't quote and say that it's from Senator Proctor, but you know where she got it, and it was newspapers as well. And anyhow.
All right, so tell us what happened with the Navy. Tell us how the USS Gloucester went in and saved the day.
I know. I know. We're going to have to do that because it's on the monument.
Right.
But I don't want you to get seasick, but I'm shifting between 1898, 1923, 1923, and 1923, Martha Brooke had to decide what this monument is going to look like. But she wants a consensus. She wants people together on it. She doesn't want ruffled feathers, especially the veterans. And she's not a veteran. So she encourages them to agree that they won't have a single solitary figure, such as Walker Hancock later designed. A beautiful design, but it would not reflect Navy and Army.
Yeah.
And she encourages the Navy to look to the USS Gloucester and Admiral Wainwright. As you know, you don't need 300 faces on this thing or names of all the people who like this roll of honor. You might do with the USS Gloucester. Why that would be a great idea, we'll flip back to
1898.
As you asked rightly, how the Navy won the war. In 1898, the USS Gloucester was the little boat in a group of battleships that were outside of Santiago, another seaport in Cuba. Well-fortified seaport. The Spanish fleet was in the harbor of Santiago. And when the Spanish fleet started to move out of the harbor, there was a signal sent. The signals were not by wireless. It was 1898.
How could they?
So it was by flags up and people on each ship had a little book, and you look into the book for this flag. What does it mean? And I have a very rare object here in my hands right here. That is the published logbook of the USS Gloucester.
No. Where did you ever find that?
Long story. But I
Well,
couldn't get it,
save that.
at least tell you, I couldn't get it in any library.
No.
I would not have bought it without if I could have gotten it at a library.
Yeah.
But it is very, I don't want to ruin its pages because it probably fall apart too quickly. But in the Battle of Santiago that we're talking about, it has pages and pages of material about what happened in different days. This battle took place July 3rd.
Okay.
Right?
Oh.
1898.
Wow.
And when it happened, the logbook rightly describes kind of Captain Wainwright ordering the USS Gloucester forward to charge, all guns firing, essentially in front of the battleship, because he was going to take on the Spanish fleet single-handed, it had to be.
Yeah.
And he did put out of operation 2 Spanish destroyers, each one bigger than his ship, before he had to sort of get off to the side and start rescuing people and let the battleships do their thing.
But he sort of led the way. The USS Gloucester led the way
right.
into the harbor.
And I've got to ask you, it's a historical mystery, but I think I've solved it, that Captain Wainwright had no intention of holding back and letting the battleship do their thing and win the war. And he was going to be there first and foremost. And his wink with his second in command, if they read the flag said something like the torpedo boats are coming out.
Oh, yeah. The American torpedo boats are coming
out.
No, the Spanish. The Spanish torpedo boats.
And his second in command said to the captain, I think fully aware of this. Let's see, in my pages here, I'm looking around, I think, this says gunboats will advance. Well, the USS Gloucester is given authority and permission to go for. Take a look at this footnote, if you will.
Okay.
In fact, I believe it's worth reading aloud.
All right.
This
whole
bottom,
thing?
this bottom footnote is worth reading aloud. Remember, this is not formally in the log entry of 1898. It's put in later because there was a controversy, and they said, "What were you doing?" And he wanted to show in the published version that Go ahead, please.
So the whole thing.
Yeah.
How big? Okay, so let me just say the initials here are HP8 at the end. That's the person who wrote it.
Right.
All right. The Gloucester was called with the intention of sending her to Soini.
Yeah.
But the admiral decided to go there himself in his flagship. Had the Gloucester been sent, she would have missed the fight.
Right. That was a little footnote first that said we were almost ordered away from Santiago, but luckily we
decided we'd go.
Now this is about 9:30 in the morning when the signal flag is up there and they have to read the book. Go ahead.
This is it. It was difficult to make out the flags through the smoke of the battle, but the chief quartermaster finally reported them. I looked in the signal book for the corresponding signal. I'm not chuckling out of disrespect.
It's
knowing the story that you just told, how interesting this is, how amazing this is.
Yes.
I looked in the signal book for the corresponding signal and read it out loud to the captain, in quote, gunboats will advance, end quote. To us, it was the most important order. We were about to enter the zone of fire of the Indiana, and the signal meant that Captain Taylor had recognized our position. Now, Captain Taylor must have been on
American.
Yeah, on fire of the Indiana.
There was a firing zone. The battleships were firing here.
Yeah.
And if obeyed, Captain Wainwright was ordering his gunboat in front of to get to the space. Go ahead.
Right. So in front of the Indiana, right?
But he says, it was a signal said advance.
Okay. Okay, so they recognized our position that we should therefore not be in danger from his fire, although
they were.
They were. Okay. It seems almost incredible that the flags actually displayed by the Indiana had no reference at all to the Gloucester. Captain Taylor was signaling to the fleet that the enemy's torpedo boats had come out. The signal, as we interpreted it, was very comforting, but it had no effect upon our movements. Wainwright had already directed me to close in on the enemy and to disregard the fire from the Indiana, as he later told me to disregard the fire from the Scopapa
whatever
battery.
Yes.
Now, so
which is the Spanish
ship. So
disregard damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. But yes.
But it's so HPH must have been his second in command.
Yes, I think it was Harry Hulse, Hulse, I think. But it doesn't matter. The main thing is what you have just read is part of history, and it's part of the mystery of history, which is did Captain Wainwright proceed without regard, really recklessly, into the zone of fire from both sides, all his guns firing, because he wanted to get a couple destroyers, which he did. I say again, as I'm repeating something you just read, which is the signal. Let's see if I can. The signal, as we interpreted it, was very comforting, but it had no effect on our movements. Wainwright had already directed me to close in on the enemy, and to disregard the fire from the Indiana and the shore battery. So, anyway, it gives you an idea of what was going on. Now, the Battle of Santiago that Wainwright led, and that was it. It was decisive. When the Spanish fleet was sunk, when the Santiago port at the lower end of Cuba was open to Americans invading, then the ship. The American ships could go into the harbor and occupy the place. The whole inner part of Cuba in all directions, it's an island, was open to the American forces.
The American forces coming
and
in.
To be supplied by the American forces. See, we need a seaport. You can't just, no parachutes, but you can't just have troops unsupported by a seaport where the supplies can keep flow. Ammunition and food and tents and all that stuff. So they had now, July 3rd, 1898, essentially the Navy had won the war. Everything else was downhill for Spain. The question would be, when were they going to put their hands up and surrender? That happened.
So the United States won the war for Cuba.
Yes.
Okay.
Then the next island. I think Captain Wainwright would say, next island. And it's Puerto Rico. The Americans were expected to attack in San Juan, very well fortified capital of Puerto Rico. But why would the Americans attack the most fortified, hardest defended, most troops? But they went down this coast to another port called Guanica. You could look it up. You put Guanica in the computer, it'll turn up. That's the start of the American invasion of Puerto Rico.
And Spain, Puerto Rico at the time was a territory of Spain.
Colony of Spain.
Colony. I'm sorry.
What was the first? Oh, this is good. What was the first ship of the American Navy to show up outside of Guanica?
Don't tell me it was USS Gloucester.
The USS Gloucester. I got it. I got to let you read this one, too. I got to let you read this one, too. It's July 25th. If you go down to Puerto Rico and ask somebody if you go down there on July 25th this year, July 25th, you say, what's going on? All the government's offices are closed. The post office is closed. It looks like a holiday. People are out. They're not working and everything. Yeah, it is a holiday. Well, what's July 25th? July 25th. That's when the American flag was pulled up in Guanica. Oh, by who? By the Marines from
the USS
Gloucester.
Wow.
Right. But I'm just, and again, it starts off. Now he's a little more cautious. Remember the thing about the flags, and I'd let you read this.
Did Wainwright go over to Puerto Rico and Guanica because they were a Spanish colony?
Right.
So it was really him going after the Spaniards who sunk the USS Maine that he was on.
Every time. I'll try to see whether we can go to Guanica on July 25th. Now, there's an entry here This is July 25th.
Yeah.
This is the logbook itself, the actual entry, no footnote.
I was just going to say no.
No after the fact thing.
Right.
Yeah. And look at the first two lines. It says 8 a.m. to noon. 8 a.m. to noon.
Okay. 8 a.m. to noon, lying off entrance of Guanica Harbor, waiting for fleet to come up.
So they're all alone by the telephone. They're up there and they're the advanced scouts.
Made signal to Massachusetts.
You made a signal to the battleship.
Yeah. Shall I go in?
Shall I go in?
Answered the Massachusetts. Yes, you can try it. And that was it.
So he this time asked, may I go to the restroom, please? And they said, go right ahead.
So
now, there's a picture here of the landing party that raised the flag.
Oh, wow.
Now, so where was the...
But wait a minute, wait. I keep interrupting you. But think of the significance there. The USS Gloucester and the USS Massachusetts.
Yeah, of course.
Just pointing that out. Yeah.
Just perfect.
Yeah, okay.
And the Marines raised that flag. Question for you.
No.
Where in the world did what city, from what place did that flag come that was raised in Guanica?
Okay, so...
From where?
Gloucester, Massachusetts. There you go.
Now, I call her Betsy Gloucester. I don't know. A seamstress in Gloucester, and I think I know her name, is Idella Spate, S-P-A-E-T-Z, for other reasons, the evidence, but I'm not going to get it. I think Idella Spates of the Belmont Clothing Company made
that flag.
In any case, somebody in Gloucester made that flag. It was sent to, at the time the USS Gloucester was launched, it was sent to them and they kept it and they used it when they needed a flag to raise in Puerto Rico. July 25th, the USS Gloucester raised the flag made in Gloucester. Okay, so you might say they won the war. On the monument, down the corner, if you go and look at the Navy side, after all the dust settled and the committee worked and Martha Brooks had her effort to mold the consensus, they agreed. Those 300 guys stepped back.
Yeah.
They didn't need anything on the monument.
Yeah.
They wanted the USS Gloucester up there. And in fact, there was only one person on the one person from Gloucester,
right.
Who was?
Oh, Vino.
Gilbert Vino.
Good memory.
Gilbert Vino.
Gilbert Vino.
Now, we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to telescope this.
Okay.
When Martha Brooks was looking for honored guests to honor at she already had the congressman and the admiral's brother and all in November, and she wasn't going to get all them again. So who was she able to honor in Memorial Day in May of 1924? She found two people who were still around in Massachusetts who had been on the USS Gloucester. One was a guy named Cooksey out in Greenfield, who was dragged in somehow to be present at the unveiling with the tablets of the monument.
Okay.
And the other was
Gilbert
Vino. Now, that was unusual in one way. I'll tell you the 1898 thing. When the USS Gloucester visited and arrived in Gloucester Harbor, and everybody was talking to reporters, and the reporters were asking them questions, and friends and family were gathering, Gilbert Vino ran from the reporters. People were yelling, who knew him, Gil, Gil, Gil. He ran from them, just kept going. He didn't want to be interviewed by any reporters. He made no statements. He didn't even stop to see his friends. Question, isn't that strange?
Well, yes.
Oh, yes?
Please don't ask me for the answer for why.
No, I won't give you the answer.
Okay,
I'll
good.
tell you the answer's in the logbook.
Oh, wow.
Okay. In the logbook, the chief engineer's report of the battle was made the next day, July 4th.
Yeah.
It's of the
July
Battle
4th,
of
yeah.
July 4th. And he says the various people distinguished themselves and everything, worked in the battle in the boiler room and stuff. They should be promoted, and they're nice people. And then he says something about others. I'll ask you to read section 4.
Okay.
This is the boiler room superintendent's report.
Okay, section 4. The following men were not on duty during the engagement. Second-class machinist George Rudicuster. Sick. Coal passer G.S. Vino, confined.
He was confined to quarters during the battle. What a tough time to have a beef with the superintendent of the boiler room or whatever he did.
Right.
So, picture this and it's true. Memorial Day, 1924, 25 years after the war. You're honored by an invitation of Martha Brooks and that committee to be up present in the platform right up there, and you're sitting in the chair to be honored, to be admired by everybody as the only Gloucester guy on the USS Gloucester, and they unveil it, and there's a picture, there's a tablet of the USS Gloucester there, and you have a secret.
Right.
On that day, July 3rd, 1898, what did you do in the war? Oh, my God.
Right.
Well, in that way, I love it because it's a story that goes full circle.
Yeah.
It's now an exercise in forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
All sins forgiven.
Yeah.
The war 25 years ago, you did your part. You were in there.
Right.
You were in the boiler room of all places.
He might not have been there that day, that moment.
But he was otherwise shoveling the coal into the boiler, and getting all the dirt and dust, the way they have it, in the lowest rank. And he wasn't promoted because he had been confined during the battle.
Yeah.
Others that were coal passers were promoted around him. He wasn't.
Yeah.
And then, admired as he was, cleansed in the blood of the Lamb as he was, you know what? The same year, 1924, he's 49 years old. He got married. He was the most eligible bachelor in town. He was the hero, Gilbert Benno, who had been on the USS Gloucester. True story of the Navy. Anyhow, so then he lived a long life. He lived until, I think it was 1949 or something, and he's buried in that same area in the front row with all the others and Company G and all those different ones. Wow. And James Centennial and that. Yeah. Right there.
Wow.
In good company.
Good for him.
Yes.
So do you have any other pictures to show us?
Let's see what we got.
Because we're just wrapping up with a few minutes left. Now, who is this?
This is J.P. Morgan,
mm-hmm.
the richest man in America, who had a yacht.
Yeah.
And why is the yacht in that story, Laura?
I'm going to guess because that's the yacht that became the USS Gloucester.
Correct.
There you go. So did the United States... Yeah, go ahead. Did they...
Commodore Morgan sold the yacht for $200,000, which...
Hold on, $200,000 in 1898?
It was like $2 million. He made a little money for used yacht. Yeah. But Joe Garland found that out. Yeah. Joe Garland wrote a book called Eastern Point, and one of the things he mentioned. Okay. Well, he mentioned a nice thing. The mayor of Gloucester was so peeved that he wasn't getting a battleship named after Gloucester, or at least a cruiser or a destroyer, one of those bigger ships. Only a gunboat? Why? He complained about it. He felt disgusted. The mayor was angry. Joe Garland, who wrote the Eastern Point book, said this. And also that this guy, J.P. Morgan, did not donate. A lot of people say donated his yacht. Did not donate his yacht. He sold it for $200,000. So anyway, yes, that's the reason. This picture. Who's next? He's the original owner of the USS Gloucester. Big enough to be, not a battleship, but big enough to be a Navy gunboat. There is the Gloucester itself. There's the Gloucester itself.
Nice.
And
so that image of the Gloucester is on the monument. Is that right?
It is. Okay. Pretty much that, looking like that. Although it was in battle because they put on it July 3rd.
I got it.
And it was in Battle of Santiago.
Okay.
Most famous of all the days of their lives. one of the most famous for Gilbert Venno as well.
I see.
There's a landing party of Marines that is on the screen.
Yeah.
They're the ones who took the flag from Gloucester that was put up in Guanaca.
And you can see them
July
holding the
25th,
flag. Yeah.
and they're holding the flag.
Yeah.
It isn't like Iwo Jima, but it's pretty close.
Right.
Because it's the flag from Gloucester.
Yeah.
Lastly, there's a stand-in, a sailor from the USS Nahant, not in fact Gilbert Venno. But I said, somebody's got to sort of look like Gilbert Venno in the war at that time, being 21, 22 years old. And I picked that as a face. I said, that kind of looked like
that
Gilbert
kind of
Venno.
young-looking man with a hat on.
Yeah.
And then I'm just looking at, as we close out here, there's also the tombstone, the headstone for Dame Centennial Nut.
True, which we showed really part one.
Yeah, we showed that in part one. And of course, there's the monument, the image of the monument
itself.
right here.
Yeah,
at the top of the street.
So we've kind of covered pretty well what happened in the creation of the monument and how they dealt with it through
the diplomacy.
Through diplomacy, Martha Brooks, and what the Navy had its side, the Army has its side.
Yeah.
And lastly, just anybody wants to know, so whatever happened to Martha Brooks?
Oh,
I can tell you.
Tell us.
Mrs. Brooks left public. She was elected to the state representative in the late 1920s.
Oh, wow.
And got married in 1929 to a man named Walter Dubois Brooking, who was a widower with 4 children in Alexandria, Virginia.
Oh.
I don't know how they met.
Yeah.
He'd been a major in World War I, and he supervised the geological department of the big company Phillips Petroleum. So he's well-to-do.
Yeah.
They all lived in Alexandria. Mrs. Brooks became Mrs. Brookings and took care of the 4 kids as her stepchildren. After Mr. Brookings died in 1950, Martha Brookings lived on in Alexandria until 1967,
wow.
when she died at age 86.
Wow.
However, she did not forget Gloucester. It was her home. She was buried at Beech Grove Cemetery.
No. Interesting.
So, anyhow.
Well, listen, Wayne,
we're
thank
so
you.
happy. I thank you for your
your
attention and
thank
your
you
help.
all out there.
I think we've got more than I could cover, but it's been a lot of fun. And reviewing these days is more than meets the eye to some of these historical events.
And just really quickly, in the seconds left, Wayne will be giving a presentation on this, the War of 1898, live in person at the Cape Air Museum.
May 23rd.
May 23rd.
True.
Yes.
It's a Gloucester 400 plus event.
So thank you all so very much. Thank you, Wayne.
There will be handouts on that day.
Yeah.
Illustrated handouts.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wayne.
Good.